Before we start the sermon today, I will start with a disclaimer. Those of you who know me well enough to know that I plan my worship services long in advance. I have all of my worship services already planned through October, so I'm way in advance. This sermon was written and in the can days ago, done, ready to go. Not one word of the sermon has been changed from its original content. Any connection to current events is nothing less than divine intervention. So I chose not to change it in any way. Not a word is added, not a word is taken away, and no images, including the image that I had picked out for the benediction, was changed since recent current events. These were all images and words that were written long before yesterday. So I just want to make that thing, and that also just might lay heavier on us to realize this is just a bigger topic than an event. You'll know what I mean when I get towards the end of my sermon here. Well, we're continuing to preach on Paul, the Paul preaching series we've been doing. And the next couple of Sundays here, though, we're going to be going a different direction. The next couple of Sundays, we are not going to be talking about Paul. I know that seems weird. We're going to continue our preaching series on Paul by not talking about Paul for the next couple of Sundays. Well, the reason is we're going to be looking at the counterpoint to Paul. You know, in life, sometimes you look at one view, but sometimes you also look at the other view of what's going on in life. So that's what we're going to be doing with Paul, is looking at both points, point and counterpoint. So we've been learning that Paul has a little different view. Paul was not a disciple of Jesus. A lot of Christians think he was one of the disciples. He was not a disciple. In fact, he never ever met Jesus a day in his life. And he had an opposing view of what the disciples believed. Now, the disciples did know Jesus and did listen firsthand to his sermons. Paul believed, as we've been learning over the past several weeks, in faith alone. Paul believed that when Jesus died, Jesus freed us from our slavery to the Jewish law. Now, on the other hand, the disciples believed that in order to follow Jesus, you need to be Jewish and follow all the Jewish laws. This is all stuff we've already talked about. And if you're not a Jew, then you need to convert to Judaism. You must be circumcised and, of course, obey all the laws. According to the disciples, Jesus was Jewish and his message was only for the Jews. One line from last week's scripture summarizes everything that we just talked about, and it's Galatians 2:9. And when James and Cephas, who's Peter, and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, Paul, they had gave Barabbas and me, Paul, the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we, Paul's group, should go to the Gentiles, and they, the disciples, should go to the circumcised, the Jews. So that was the scripture verse last week. So we spent several weeks talking about Paul's mission to the Gentiles, so let's take a deeper dive into the disciples' very Jewish view. When we look at the Gospel of Matthew specifically, we find Jesus saying in his own words that his message is only for the Jews. And we have sayings in his own words saying that Jesus did not come to abolish the law. Matthew 5:17, Jesus speaking here, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So according to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus himself said he did not come to abolish the law. But the Apostle Paul, who we've been learning about for several weeks, said that the very reason Jesus came and died on the cross was to abolish the law. According to the Gospel of Matthew, from Jesus' own lips, Jesus said that he came to fulfill the law. And Paul is telling all of his followers that they no longer need to fulfill the law. Matthew 10:5-6, Jesus says this, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not take the road that leads to the Gentiles, the non-Jews. And do not enter a Samaritan town, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, Jesus is sending out his disciples and gave them strict instructions, only go among the Jews. And finally, Matthew 15:24, Jesus answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, I was sent only to the Jews. So clearly the Jewish understanding of Jesus can be found in the Bible, although it's much more difficult to find this Jewish view because Paul's theology won out. And the New Testament is Paul's theology. Paul's writings make up many of the letters in the New Testament. Many of the other letters are followers of Paul who wrote letters. Some of them, like the book of Acts, is about Paul. And the Gospels have a Pauline theological view at its base. But when we look closely, we can still find scraps kind of left in the Bible, kind of here and there, of the original Jewish understanding that the disciples would have had. Now, today we're going to look a little closer at the Jewish belief of these disciples. To do this, it's pretty simple. These disciples were Jewish. I don't think it's disputed. You guys know they were Jewish, right? You guys do know Jesus was Jewish, right? Some people don't know that. So if they're Jewish, what do Jewish people believe? So we can look at what Jewish people believe today and more specifically what they believed 2,000 years ago. So as we look at the Jewish beliefs, pay close attention to the images on the screen. The images are not a mistake. The images are very intentional to add a different layer of provocative thought to the sermon. So what do Jewish people believe? Well, first of all, they believe in the Messiah, okay? So first and foremost, Judaism believes in the coming of the Messiah. And we should have another slide up there that says Messiah up there. There we go. So they believe in the Messiah. Now, most Jews do not believe that Jesus was the fulfillment of that prophecy of the Messiah. The main definition of a Messiah is someone who's going to liberate the Jews from their oppressor, which at that time were the Romans. And not only did Jesus never liberate them from their oppressor, the Romans killed Jesus. So most all the Jews were like, well, this isn't our guy then, okay? The disciples were among a tiny group who believed that Jesus was indeed the Messiah, that he's going to come back and finish the job. But this doesn't mean that the Jews thought that Jesus was God. Jews do not believe that a human would become a god or God would ever become a human. The belief in a Messiah is something different than the belief in a godship of anyone. They're two different concepts, but a lot of times in Christianity they get conflated. So the disciples believed that Jesus was the Messiah. The next thing we'll look at is Abraham, the prophet Abraham. As Jews, these disciples trace their beliefs back to Abraham. In fact, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, when it was built on the top of Mount Moriah. And a lot of people don't know this, but there is an exposed rock left at the top of the mountain. And at this pinnacle point where the exposed rock is, that's where Abraham was said to have almost sacrificed his son in a display of his faith, a test of his faith. So they left this rock exposed, built a temple, and then the holiest of holies was built over this exposed rock. And that was where the holiest of holies was, in the temple. Nowadays, they have the temples destroyed, or mostly destroyed, and sitting upon that same spot where the holiest of holies were is the Dome of the Rock, if you've ever heard of the Dome of the Rock. You ever wonder why they call it the Dome of the Rock? Now you know. Now, Jewish people always had dietary restrictions as well. So a part of the Jewish law were the dietary laws. They told you what you can eat, what you cannot eat, and even how it should be prepared. Another thing that Jewish people believed in is circumcision. As we've mentioned before, circumcision was a main topic for Paul throughout his writings. The Jewish people believed strongly that you must be circumcised. And we've read in the Bible terminology of the uncircumcised and the circumcised. They're used as identifiers for the two groups. Paul's group were the uncircumcised, and the disciples' group were the circumcised. We saw that even in today's reading, Galatians 2:9. Now, of course, prayer. Jewish people believe in prayer. This shouldn't be too surprising. Most faiths believe in some form of prayer. But what's interesting, a little known fact a lot of people don't realize, especially if you're not Jewish, within Judaism, there are 5 prayers a good Jew does each day. Now, if you know anything about Judaism, you're probably thinking, well, they do 3 prayers a day. No, they pray 3 times a day, but there are 5 prayers a good Jew does each day. They pray 5 prayers a day. Another thing Jewish people do is they do ritual cleansing. And, before certain things, certain rites, especially before prayer, there's a ritual cleansing. And I've been blessed to go to Israel a couple of times, and the Western Wall is still standing. It's the only part of the temple that's really you can go to and really see. It's just a wall. And you go there and pray, and before you go pray at the wall, there are these stations where you can do your ritual cleansing. And there's a certain specific way. You start with one hand and another hand, and a certain way you ritually cleanse to be ritually clean to go to prayer. That is a Jewish rite. Within Judaism, there's always the rite of pilgrimage. You must make a pilgrimage if you are a good Jew. When the temple was still standing, they would make an annual pilgrimage to the temple. And even today, Jews make a pilgrimage to Israel. It's a rite of passage thing that even the Israeli government pays the full cost for young adults to make this rite of passage, this pilgrimage to go to Israel. It's part of the Jewish faith. And in the Bible, we can even see stories of the family of Jesus making this Jewish pilgrimage to the temple. So the disciples of Jesus and Paul's Gentile group believes 2 very different paths in how to follow Jesus. The disciples would make their pilgrimage each year. The disciples believed in ritual cleansing before prayer. The disciples believed in going to do 5 prayers a day. The disciples believed in circumcision, and the 12 disciples believed in obeying their dietary rites. Now, if you've been paying close attention, this might be shocking to present this information in this way. The fact is that the disciples were practicing a religion that more closely looks like Islam than it looks like modern-day Christianity. Although this might be difficult for some people to swallow, the reason for this is pretty simple. The Bible presents Paul's theology. The Bible does not present the disciples' theology unless you're really looking for it. Christianity is following the religion of Paul, not the religion of the disciples. Now, if we get over this initial shock, because I understand this is a pretty big shocker for people probably, there is great beauty in this. There are 3 faiths, but one God. Islam and Judaism are often presented in the news as being very different religions that are opposite one another. When we step back, we realize how closely aligned these 2 religions truly are. In fact, when Islam began, this is another shocker information for you, Muhammad was preaching primarily to the Jewish community. Muhammad saw his message as being so Jewish that the early Muslims faced the temple in Jerusalem when they prayed, not Mecca. It was only later they changed the direction to Mecca. It was a Jewish faith. Not only is Judaism and Islam incredibly similar, when we step back and take another closer look, we can see Christianity and Islam is incredibly similar. Muslims believe in the Immaculate Conception of Mary and the virgin birth of Jesus. Muslims believe Jesus performed miracles. The Quran tells multiple stories of the miracles of Jesus. Muslims believe that Jesus was not only a great teacher, but that Jesus was indeed the expected Messiah. Muslims believe that right now, Jesus is in heaven with God. And Muslims believe that Jesus will return in a second coming and defeat evil and bring peace on earth. Islam and Christianity are far more closer than people realize. These two religions are nothing more than the final result of two distinctly paths that evolved over time from the very beginning, Paul and the disciples. Essentially, we are all teaching the same message, but just a different emphasis on how we practice that message. Now, even though some people may have been struggling in parts of this sermon about how closely Islam and Christianity are related and how closely the disciples probably practiced an Islamic style of faith, generally most people in this room probably do not have any problem with the overall message. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are just simply more alike than different. Why can't we get along? I think we all can agree on that. And despite our differences, we should embrace those beliefs that we do share, and even embrace the beliefs that we don't share. They do this and we do that. That's fine. Most people here would probably either identify as a progressive Christian or compassionate conservative. And most people here can probably get on board with embracing our Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters. If I were to suggest doing a mission project with the local Islamic mosque in our community, this congregation would gladly leap at the chance. You would love that. I know you. You'd love that. And quickly, after we did that mission, we'd pat ourselves on the back for being so loving and accepting. If I were to invite an imam, which is their preacher, by the way, if I were to invite the imam from the local mosque to come and preach in this pulpit, this church would be a packed house. You'd be bringing your neighbors here. You'd love it. You'd be eager to hear what this man had to say. And when he finished preaching, this congregation would probably erupt in a standing ovation in support of his message. And then we'd all pat ourselves on the back for being so loving and accepting. But what happens when we present the idea of three faiths and one God in a different context? What do we suppose would happen if I reached out to one of the most conservative, evangelical, anti-gay churches in our area to arrange a joint mission? How many people would show up? How many people would be in my office before that event happened protesting such a partnership? And if I invited the preacher from that same conservative, evangelical, anti-gay church to come here and preach on Sunday morning, what would our attendance be like that Sunday? How empty would this church be? And how many angry emails and phone calls would I receive begging me to please disinvite this minister from preaching here? Here's the point. What's our favorite saying? Love is love, right? Do we know what that means? Acceptance is acceptance. Welcoming is welcoming. We do realize that Islam as a whole is not known for their extravagant embrace of the gay community. We do know that, right?
Yes, I do.
But we would quickly turn a blind eye and accept their differences, that they believe something different that we passionately agreed differently with, in order for the spirit of unity. And of course, for the opportunity to pat ourselves on the back for being so loving and accepting. Because it's in vogue to have our Muslim friend get a photo op with our Muslim friend. So we pat ourselves on the back for being so open and accepting. I think most people here probably realize that generally, and I say generally, Muslim women do not really have absolute freedom to proclaim my body, my choice. But in the spirit of unity, even the biggest feminist Christian is willing to set aside that tiny little difference we have with the Muslims in order to open the door for meaningful partnership with the Muslim community, and then pat ourselves on the back for being so loving and accepting and get our photo op. You know, we have more in common with the fundamentalist evangelical gay church down the road than we have in common with the Islamic mosque. They're Muslim, we're Christian, okay? We have more in common with the fundamentalist anti-gay church down the road. Then why do we find it so easy to be in conversation with the Muslims who have a very similar social view as the evangelical Christians, yet find it so difficult to be in conversation with evangelical Christians who have a very similar view of the Muslims? One gives us a good photo op and a warm, fuzzy feeling. The other one does not. But other than that, they're believing pretty much the same thing. This progressive hypocrisy must end. The religion of Abraham is a big umbrella. From the disciples to Paul, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and all the subsets of Christianity. All the brands of Christianity. Of all those different brands of Christianity, we may be a part of the most difficult brand of Christianity to be a part of. Most people who come to this church under the false assumption that our love and acceptance, our lack of strict rules, our lack of absolute dogma and doctrine makes this an easy place to be a Christian because we don't have all those rules. On the contrary, this very place, Windermere Union Church, is perhaps the most challenging and difficult forms of Christianity on the planet. Other Christians believe in putting the 10 Commandments central to their faith. Everyone's like, oh, that's so hard. They're rigid. How rigid can you be? How hard is that? Have you read the 10 Commandments? Just don't be a horrible person. Don't murder and sleep with your neighbor. You're God. That's one of the easiest forms of Christianity, but it somehow gets the reputation for being one of the most difficult. And then there are other churches who make their own list of do's and don'ts, and we've talked about this before, and whether one agrees with the list of do's and don'ts or not, it's pretty simple. Just obey the list and you're good. And if you don't like that list, go to another church that has a list that you like and then obey their list. It's pretty simple to do that. We at Windermere Union Church have one rule and one rule only that we say over and over again. Love your neighbor as yourself. This may undoubtedly be the most difficult brand of Christianity. The second anyone shows any hate towards any group, they have broken the one and only rule we have here. The second anyone shows any hate towards any politician, they have failed at the one and only rule that we have here. The second anyone shows any hate for any other preacher out there or any other church out there, they have broken the one and only rule that we have at this church. Progressive Christianity is only simple for the superficial hypocrites who use love as a catchphrase and then pat ourselves on the back when we love at our own convenience. If we want to be the best Christians we can be, then love must be universal, unconditional, and unending. If love is ever easy, simple, and joyful, then you're doing it wrong. Without a doubt, the most challenging thing God ever called us to do is love. Amen. And I invite Winsong to come forward for the benediction.
This particular prayer about the Great Spirit was translated by Lakota Sioux Chief Yellowlark in 1887. O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds and whose breath gives me life, gives life to all the world. Hear me, I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever hold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things that you have made and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things that you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons that you have hidden in every rock and leaf. Let me remain calm and strong in the face of all that comes towards me. Help me find compassion without empathy overwhelming me. I seek strength not to be greater than my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so that when life fades as the fading sunset, my spirit may come to you without shame.
There's a place in your heart, and I know that it is